So anyway, to try to defend all of this, these distinctions, and to understand liberalism, we argued in Norms of Liberty that if we look at human flourishing, individualistic perfectionism again, we're going to find a view of perfection, of human perfection, human flourishing, that is objective, individualized, agent-relative, self-directed, and social. And when we consider all of those factors, what it means to be a flourishing human being, and once we reject the idea that objectivity requires that something be universal, that it's possible for something to be objective and individualized, and once we understand that the human flourishing is always related to a particular person, then we have some traction for showing, and this is one of our big points in the book, that the aim of the political legal order cannot be to achieve human flourishing or even the conditions for human flourishing, because it's too diverse, it's too different. And more importantly, what usually happens when you try to do that, you also end up running afoul of one of the central features of the nature of human flourishing, namely that human flourishing is not something that happens to you, it's something that you do yourself. It's a self-directed activity. Now, because of this account of human flourishing, and I can't go through the whole book, obviously, but what we say is there's a problem that results. And the problem is the problem of how do we integrate a political legal order in such a way that's going to deal with the diversity of flourishing? How do we have principles that will apply to everybody and at the same time will not prejudice that political order towards one form of flourishing as opposed to another? And we call this sort of question that comes about from our account of individualistic perfectionism, we call it a problem or a task that political philosophy has to address. And we call it liberalism's problem because liberalism has been one of the few theories that has, for the most part, understood that the question for political philosophy is how do we have rules of the game that will not be prejudicial against one form of flourishing as opposed to another, rules of the game that will respect the uniqueness of individuals, rules of the game that will protect the self-directedness of people, and thereby allow for the possibility of people exercising their choices. How do we do that? And that problem we call liberalism's problem. Okay? Because liberalism addresses it. It's not a problem for liberalism in the sense it's a weakness of liberalism, but in the sense it's liberalism's task. And so that's how we use that term. And so what we do in addressing this task, which we call liberalism's problem, how do we get this unity among all this diversity, we end up having a set of criteria that needs to be fulfilled, and I've already gone through some of them. And so what we end up saying is that it is really a mistake to try to have the political order primarily or directly aim at achieving the human good. Rather, you want to find a solution to this problem. This problem is legitimate. How do we solve it? Well, we argue that the only feature of human flourishing that we can use to solve liberalism's problem is the protection of the possibility of self-direction. And the way that we do that is we have a set of meta-norms that protect that possibility, and that's what negative rights end up being. And this is a long story, but this is the idea. And once we have this idea, then we can go on and say, but look, when we're debating with people about what should or should not be done, do not grant the premise that, oh, this is good for human beings. Once you get into the debate of government or the state or the law exists to do what's good for human beings, then any and everything that could be good for human beings or could promote something that would help human beings achieve their good is a plausible candidate for government action. And the whole inside of the liberal tradition is to say, no, statecraft is not soulcraft, and this is the key insight. And so what you'd like to do, and we say this in the book, is just as is generally recognized in our culture, that the political should be separate from the religious. What we want to say is the political should be separate from the substantive ethics, okay? Now, in another sense, of course, we are making an ethical claim because we endorse rights. But rights are norms that have to do with how to play the game, not how to play the game well. And so, in a way, this is how we want to do that. There's a lot of interesting arguments along the way that need to be looked at by people. And what Doug and I think works well in Norms of Liberty is that we go through lots of objections against liberalism, and indeed lots of objections against an individualistic perfectionism, and show that they can be met, and we do have a way of making an argument for the liberal order. And so that is sort of maybe a long-winded version of an answer to your question. Well, I'm going to name about, I think, four. Obviously, Aristotle, for his metaphysical realism, for his moderate essentialism, for his life-based natural teleology, for his understanding that logic is a human tool, not just something purely formal, for his understanding of practical wisdom, and what he suggests by that. I think in modern philosophy, there's two people that I think should be paid a lot more attention to. I like the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid for his criticisms of Hume, especially on the issue of conceivability. Then there's a Latin Aristotelian whose name is John of St. Thomas, or John, his religious name was John of St. Thomas. John Poisson is how he's known today more. And he was writing in the 16th century, and he gives us an understanding of awareness and ideas as formal signs, not as something, not as in the Latin, not as id quod, but id quo. In other words, ideas are not something that you know, but they're that by which you know. And he has a long discussions of this, and I think he's a tremendously important source. So John of St. Thomas, or John Poisson. And then finally, I like Anthony Kinney's version. Anthony Kinney is a Oxford Don, and I like his interpretation and understanding of the later Wittgenstein. In particular, how Wittgenstein can be used as a source of arguing against private languages, and also against what I would call an excessive rationalistic approach to philosophy. So those would be the people that historically in philosophy that I think I've learned a lot from, and I take something from. Yeah, well, what we're ultimately talking about, I think, if we're going to talk about human flourishing and individualistic perfectionism, if that's going to be the way in which you find the account of how you justify a liberal political legal order, then you've got to be able to make sense of such claims as there's such a thing as human nature. You've got to be able to say that our account of what human beings are is not just something that we made up. It's not just a sort of pragmatic convention that we use, something that's useful for advancing our ends. We have to say something more than that. We have to say somehow that our concepts do map reality. And so this is where I think getting it right on metaphysics and epistemology is very important. In other words, I think it's vital that we be able to say that there are things that exist and they are what they are apart from human awareness, and that we can, with great difficulty, still come to know these things. It may be a process of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but we need to have that if we're going to be able to get an ethics, or even, I think, ultimately a political philosophy off the ground. Now, it's not a straight deductive line. I'm not saying you say you got your metaphysical premise and out pops individual rights. It's not that kind of thing. But you need to have a context in which you work, in which you reason. And I'm not a fan, I'll be very blunt about this, of contemporary analytic philosophy's use of intuitions as just a starting point, and one just says, well, that's what I'm going to work with. I mean, I think I'm not anti-intuition. I think there's a point for that kind of language and direct insight. But I think you have to be able to put those intuitions in a context that supports and makes sense of them. So I'm fairly systematic or traditionalist. I think you need to pay attention to those more fundamental issues. I guess I could also say, though, that when I was talking about Aristotle, I truly think he gives us an approach to ethics that's important. Ethics is for living. And if ethics doesn't only relate to our lives and what we do, if it's something that you could ignore, like I guess I could ignore chess and I could continue to live quite well. Well, if ethics has no greater status than chess, then I think some people might say, well, why bother? In fact, among my students, it's always interesting that they come in and the standard freshman and sophomore has, well, why do I give a hoot about any of these things? You know, why does this matter and all of that? And they expect me to some extent to say, well, these things are just things you need to know. And I say, no, that's a very good question. Why do we care about ethics? Let's start that way. And so I think Aristotle is in that right vein. And I think when we get away from that in talking about ethics, I think we risk making the entire enterprise irrelevant. Well, I want to preface this by saying, given the standard or general interpretations of these people, okay, because history of philosophy is always coming up with new insights and new things about things, but I would say, standing on one foot, that would be Descartes. I think the idea that you can start out with an awareness of one's ideas and plausibly ask whether there's anything else other than one's own ideas is just a huge philosophical mistake. I think it's a non-starter. And then I think the standard reading of Kant, both in terms of epistemology and in terms of ethics, I find non-starters as well, even though about both philosophers, obviously, they're brilliant and they have lots of things to learn from them. And would never tell my students, don't read or study or learn from these people. But fundamentally, Descartes and Kant would be the philosophers I disagree with the most.